अस्सलाम वालेकुम स्टूडेंट्स, उम्मीद है आप खैरियत से होंगे। आज हम इस सिलसिले का लेक्चर नंबर 20 स्टडी करेंगे। पिछले लेक्चर में हमने एक नया टॉपिक शुरू किया था एंड दैट वाज काउंसलिंग प्रोसेस। दिस इज़ आल्सो अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट एरिया इन द सिलेबस ऑफ काउंसलिंग। जैसे कि मैंने पहले ये कहा था कि काउंसलिंग स्किल्स बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट हैं और वो आप देखेंगे कि काउंसलिंग प्रोसेस की जब हम बात करते हैं तो काउंसलिंग स्किल्स का जिक्र भी बार बार आएगा। In the previous lecture, we talked about different factors that could influence, in fact, the outcome of counseling process. What are these factors? सबसे पहले हमने बात की थी structure of the counseling session. उससे बात का आगाज किया था। Structure से ये मुराद है कि counseling का session कैसे चलेगा, overall उसका structure क्या होगा, कितने मिनट का एक सेशन होगा, टोटल कितने सेशंस होंगे, क्लाइंट की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज़ क्या हैं और काउंसलर्स की ऑब्लिगेशंस और रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज़ क्या है एंड सो ऑन। एंड देन वी आल्सो डिस्कस्ड के इसमें यह भी डिटरमिन किया जाता है कि जो क्लाइंट है वो कितनी फ़ी पे करेगा, किस टाइम पर आएगा, एंड देन द क्लाइंट is also informed about different other aspects of counseling interviews. For example, the nature of counseling, the client is also informed about the credentials and educational बैकग्राउंड ऑफ द काउंसलर। उसको एक्सपीरियंस जो भी काउंसलर का है, उसकी स्पेशलाइजेशन है, उसके बारे में मुकम्मल इंफॉर्मेशन दी जाती है। एंड देन ही इज आल्सो अश्योर्ड अबाउट द कॉन्फिडेंशियलिटी ऑफ द रिकॉर्ड्स ऑफ द काउंसलिंग सेशंस। सो सेकेंडली वी टॉक्ड अबाउट इनिशिएटिव। वी आल्सो डिस्कस्ड दैट स्ट्रक्चर इज यूजुअली मेंटेन्ड बाय द काउंसलर। सो काउंसलर टेक्स द एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव कंट्रोल ऑफ द काउंसलिंग सेशंस, चाहे पहला हो, चाहे आखिरी हो या बीच वाले सेशंस हो। बट द इनिशिएटिव इज मोस्टली रिलेटेड विद द इंडिविजुअल क्लाइंट। इट इज द रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी ऑफ द क्लाइंट टू वर्क फॉर द सक्सेस ऑफ द काउंसलिंग सेशंस। और वो किस तरह से होगा कि दैट ही और शी शैल बी एबल एंड शैल बी विलिंग टू वर्क ऑन एनी चेंज दैट कुड टेक प्लेस ड्यूरिंग द काउंसलिंग प्रोसेस या सेशंस। और एक हमने ये बात भी की थी कि इट्स अ काइंड ऑफ स्ट्रगल। First struggle that is maintaining the structure is by the counselor, while the other जो struggle है that is usually the responsibility of the individual client. And then finally we talked about clients' qualities, and we discussed whether clients' qualities could also affect the counseling process, and we found out that research has shown that those clients who are intelligent, who are verbal, who are more communicative and who are young, they are perceived more favorably by the counselors as compared to old clients या फिर unintelligent और non-verbal clients जो हैं they are not very much appreciated. एक और चीज़ जो हमने डिस्कस की थी वो ये थी कि जो disadvantaged clients हैं they are also not very much appreciated, and I think this is the matter of great concern कि why a person who is having disadvantage on some aspect of his life, for example the person is disabled, why that person will not be appreciated and why counselors would not like to have counseling sessions with him. But the research has shown that this is the fact. Disadvantaged लोग जो हैं उनके साथ sessions बहुत ज़्यादा comfortable नहीं होते counselors, or maybe due to their own defenses or problems, and everyone perhaps likes to communicate with those people who are responsive, who are intelligent and who are verbal. एक और चीज़ जो मैं मेंशन करना चाहूँगी in reference to previous lecture, that in reference to initiative we also talked about two kinds of clients. एक resistant client and the other one is reluctant client. Reluctant client are those clients who are sent by somebody else for the counseling. So that is why they are unmotivated. For example, school children on their disruptive behavior could be sent by their teacher and principal to the school counselor. And then we talked about resistant client. Resistant client are those clients who are unwilling to change, but they would defend this by saying yes but इस तरह की statements देंगे कि हाँ ये तो ठीक है, I admit, I understand that is right, but different problems जो हैं वो present करेंगे. So this was in relation to clients' qualities, कि client जो हैं वो किस तरह के counseling में appropriate समझे जाते हैं। What about counselor? Counselor in fact has a great role as far as success of counseling process is concerned. So what are different characteristics of an effective counselor? We have discussed all that in detail in previous lectures. थोड़ा सा मैं यहाँ पे, क्योंकि ये इस टॉपिक के साथ इसका ताल्लुक है, थोड़ा सा इसको दोबारा डिस्क्राइब करना चाहूँगी. Strong in 1968 identifies 3 characteristics of influential counselors. First, they are experts in their area. Second, they are attractive. And the third thing is they are trustworthy. The first thing is they are experts. Obviously, they are knowledgeable, they are competent, and they are perceived like that by individual clients. So, इसके लिए important है, the counselor must work within the boundary of his experience and qualification. For example, if a counselor is having expertise in family counseling, या फिर एक खास theoretical orientation के तहत एक काउंसलर काम करता है, तो he or she must practice that. और उस बाउंड्री से नहीं निकलना चाहिए, so that the client thinks that he is the knowledgeable person, he is the appropriate person, और मैं सही बंदे के पास हेल्प के लिए आया हूँ या आई हूँ. Second thing is attractiveness. अब the question is that what determines attractiveness? In the previous lecture, I also stated there are several things which make a person attractive. It's not only physical attractiveness that is important, the way a person talks is also important. If a person is similar to you, then you will perceive that person as more attractive. So research has shown that those people who talk appropriately, in that sense ke they are saying whatever they are saying it clearly. Their talk is clear. जो कुछ वो कहना चाहते हैं वो अच्छी तरह से इसको convey कर सकते हैं. So these people are considered attractive. People who are similar to the client, they are considered attractive. और ये बिल्कुल true इसी तरह से है जिस तरह से काउंसलर को भी ऐसे client अच्छे लगते हैं जो उससे मिलते जुलते हैं. इसीलिए बाज़ औक़ात ये कहते हैं कि क्लाइंट्स को उन्हीं काउंसलर्स के पास भेजा जाए जो उनकी एथनिसिटी से ताल्लुक़ रखते हैं. और ये ऐसी सोसाइटीज़ में बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है विच आर मल्टी कल्चरल सोसाइटीज़. सो दैट इज़ वाई यूजुअली multicultural societies like to have counselors from different ethnic backgrounds so that they could be able to deal with clients with diverse cultural and ethnic origins. The next point was trustworthiness of the counselor. How a counselor will be perceived as trustworthy. We have also discussed that before, that if a client perceives that a counselor is caring, has concern for his or her problems, then that will be an important step in establishing the trust between client and counselor. तो trustworthy होने के लिए ज़रूरी है कि you are a good listener, you are properly listening and attending. ये नहीं है कि आप, जैसे कि मैंने एक मिसाल दी थी एक दफ़ा, कि क्लाइंट कुछ बता रहा है और आप एकदम सवाल कर लेते हैं जो कि अनरिलेटेड होता है करंट टॉक के साथ. जैसे कि अच्छा आप फर्स्ट ईयर में पढ़ते हैं ना, एंड द क्लाइंट इज टॉकिंग अबाउट सम इमोशनल एस्पेक्ट. So all these factors are important in creating trust of the counselor. Ocon in 1992 listed 5 important characteristics of an effective counselor. What are these characteristics? Self-awareness. The goal of the counseling is that the client becomes self-aware. और उसकी आगाही के लिए ज़रूरी है कि the person who is providing counselor is also self-aware. उसको अपने बारे में पता हो, and off and on he could provide self-disclosure also. Second thing is honesty. The person should be honest in dealing with the problems of the client. He should not have wearing a artificial face of honesty, लेकिन अंदर से वो different हो. He should be genuine and congruent. Then congruence is the next related quality, ability to communicate and knowledge. ये अगर देखा जाए तो पहले वाली जो 3 हमने characteristics का जिक्र किया था, they are quite similar with each other. Now I will be briefly talking about 5-stage structure of interview. When I say interview, I do not mean that it is just one interview. It is about the whole counseling process. There could be 5 stages, arbitrary stages हैं, ये कुछ इससे इनहराफ भी लोग महसूस कर सकते हैं, but generally these are considered the 5 stages of counseling. ओवरऑल काउंसलिंग इंटरव्यू जो होता है, चाहे वो इसमें 10 सेशंस हैं या 20 सेशंस हैं. इसका मतलब ये हुआ कि ये ज़रूरी नहीं है कि जो पहली चीज़ मैं कहूँगी इसमें 5 स्टेजेस में, दैट इज़ कवर्ड इन 1 इंटरव्यू, द सेकंड इज़ कवर्ड इन सेकंड इंटरव्यू. इट्स नॉट लाइक दैट, बिकॉज some sessions more than 1 or 2 could be devoted for one particular stage. अब ये stages कौन कौन सी हैं, और ये भी हो सकता है कि ये सारी stages एक interview में भी सारी cover हो जाएं, but it depends on the problem of the client. First stage is that you create rapport and establish structure. So this is obviously the first important step, that relationship जो है, जो which is the basic and basis of counseling profession, तो वो जो relationship है वो strong हो, और there is a good rapport between client and counselor. And then everything about the structure is decided. और structure का जिक्र हम पहले कर चुके हैं डिटेल में. ये structure जो है अगर ना हो किसी भी counseling session का, तो that just wanders aimlessly. It's very important that it is described before very clearly, so that client and counselor are both aware of their roles and obligations. Second thing is that you gather data and identify assets of the client. So whatever information you require for working on the problem of the client, उनको identify कर लें. Because if you do not know the context of the problem, if you do not know about your client, तो आप all of a sudden you cannot solve a problem. तो आप उसके बारे में जब पूरी तरह आगाह ही नहीं हैं, तो कैसे उसके problems को समझेंगे? So you gather that data which is important for that particular client and for that particular problem. And then you also identify the assets and strengths of your client. क्योंकि आपने काउंसलिंग में क्या करना है कि उन स्ट्रेंथ्स को आगे लेके चलना है, और अगर कोई वीकनेसेस हैं उन पे कम ध्यान देना है. एंड आई थिंक आई हैव मेंशन्ड दैट इन वन ऑफ माय प्रीवियस लेक्चर्स के द फोकस इज नॉट ऑन द वीकनेसेस, द फोकस इज ऑन द स्ट्रेंथ्स of the client, because strengths will determine what a person can do and concentrate on his problems in a particular direction. The third stage is that you determine outcome and goal setting. So you ask your client, maybe directly or indirectly, that what does he want to achieve from that counseling? क्यों आया था वो इस काउंसलिंग के लिए, या फिर जिसने भेजा है, what was the purpose of that person? So it is important that we identify goals. Goals होंगी तो उसके मुताबिक आप आगे चलेंगे. If there are no goals, then how can I proceed? Because goals को लेकर ही client चलता है और goals को लेकर ही counselor चलता है. If there are identifiable goals, then we work accordingly. And each and every step of counseling process is determined by the identification of goals. Then the fourth stage is generating alternative solutions. आप alternative solutions भी हो सकते हैं कोई या नहीं. We talked about that also previously, that the client is used to of perceiving things in a particular way, और बाज़ औक़ात उसको change भी नहीं करना चाहता. But it is very important to look for other alternatives which may be more suited with the current situation of the client. Maybe उनकी तरफ उनका ध्यान ना गया हो client का, लेकिन वो adjustment के लिए बहुत ज़रूरी हो. So it is always important to look at the alternative explanations of the problems, your perceptions, and your perception regarding the relationship of the client with significant others. And then you generalize and transfer learning to real life situation. The purpose of the counseling is not only that the client feels comfortable in the counseling session. Counseling हो रही है, वो बड़ा मुतमईन है counselor के साथ, और वो कह रहा है yes I am satisfied. This is not the purpose, क्योंकि उसको तो terminate होना है. That relationship is not forever. It is eventually to be terminated. So important thing ये है कि whatever the client has learned during the counseling sessions should be transferred to the real and daily life situation. So here comes the work of the counselor. The counselor gives many homework assignments which could be applied in real life setting, and he could ask again and again, will you do that, will you do that, and so on. So these are 5 stages of counseling interview या session, और उसके मुताबिक जो है वो हम counseling को आगे बढ़ाते हैं. So let's first talk about initial session. When we are talking about counseling process, so in fact this is related with initial session, then the middle phase, and middle phase could also be called like working in the relationship, action phase जो आपकी है counselor की. So middle phase के बाद termination phase, the last one. So we will be talking about these three phases of a counseling interview. चाहे आप इसको overall को एक interview consider करें, or maybe you will be saying that you will achieve this particular goal, target 20 sessions, 25 sessions and so on. So first of all, we will be talking about initial session. पहला session कैसे होगा? It's the initial session या interview when subject of the subsequent sessions will be discussed and determined. So initial session is very important because that will determine कि counseling कैसे चलनी है. बाकी sessions में क्या होना है, this is to be decided in the first session. There are several skills which are useful during this phase of counseling. अब why different skills are required in the initial session? To create a rapport between client and counselor. Because once the rapport is established, then it is more easy for the client to proceed toward the desired direction. अब initial session अगर successful नहीं है तो it is really difficult कि वो बाद में जो है वो बहुत smoothly counseling चले. Sometime it is possible कि initial session में वो client जो है वो still is very resistant or resistance shows in number of further sessions और बाद में वो comfortable हो जाए, लेकिन usually जो है वो it is the responsibility of the counselor and skill of the counselor that the initial sessions जो है that is conducted comfortably and there is an attempt on the part of the counselor that initial session में ही rapport establish हो जाए कुछ ना कुछ. Now I'll be talking about different types of initial interviews. कौन कौन सी इकसाम होती हैं initial interviews की. Initial interview can be counselor generated or client generated. Or initial interview can be information oriented or relationship oriented. So let's discuss these types. First is client versus counselor initiated or generated interviews. अब ये नाम से जाहिर है कि या तो वो जो इंटरव्यू है वो उसकी रिक्वेस्ट क्लाइंट ने की होगी या काउंसलर ने की होगी. So Benjamin in 1987 distinguishes between these two types of initial interviews. One is client initiated, the other is counselor initiated. Client initiated, as I said before, that is initiated by the client because client wanted to see the counselor for some problem, for discussion of some issue. And when client is initiating that interview या फिर session, it may create anxiety in the counselor. Not in all situations, but sometime when the counselor is not very experienced, तो उसको ये बताया जाए कि कोई client जो है वो आपके साथ ये सेशन करना चाहता है, तो मे बी समटाइम द काउंसलर थिंक कि क्या बात हो सकती है. सो ही मे बी थिंकिंग अबाउट हिज और हर कॉम्पिटेंसीज के प्रॉब्लम के साथ पता नहीं आई एम कैपेबल टू डील विद आर नॉट एंड आई डोंट नो हाउ शैल आई respond and so on. So there could be some anxiety in the counselor, but it is not essential that every counselor will be experiencing that anxiety. And then Benjamin advises not to inquire initially about any problem. When it is client initiated, then it is not essential that counselor says in the beginning that what is your problem, because it is possible that the client does not have as such a problem. The client just wants to discuss some issue for better clarity. तो problem का लफ्ज़ ना बोला जाए तो बेहतर है, because उससे client may get anxious कि अच्छा मेरा क्या problem है, so he may be thinking about in the problem sense. तो it is important कि वो एक generally बात शुरू की जाए और उसकी बात पहले सुन ली जाए कि what does that client want. कभी कभार होता है कि इस तरह की situation होती है कि client जो है वो schools में भी हो सकता है, colleges में भी हो सकता है कि client would request a meeting with the counselor. The other type of interview is counselor initiated. Counselors should immediately state the reason for seeing the client. Sometimes counselor feels कि इस बच्चे का जो स्कूल में जो प्रोफाइल पढ़ा जा रहा है तो वो ठीक नहीं लग रहा, मार्क्स ख़राब हैं, उसको पता चलता है उसकी हिस्ट्री कहीं पे लिखी हुई है बच्चे की कि सिंगल पेरेंट फैमिली है, कोई और प्रॉब्लम्स हैं. सो the counselor thinks that it is appropriate that he or she must see the client. और usually ये है कि उसमें अपनी reason जो है वो describe कर देनी चाहिए. Then multimodal functioning of counselors is important, and it means that visual, auditory, written and descriptive modes can be used. while you are getting information from the client, while you are having interaction with the client, it is more effective if you use all modes of communication. चाहे आप verbal use कर रहे हैं, visual use कर रहे हैं, auditory use कर रहे हैं, descriptive also, how do you describe that, आप उसका record जो है वो कैसे ले रहे हैं. The next type of initial interview is information oriented interview. Initial interview can fulfill two functions, and that was pointed out by Hackney and Cormier in 1994. What are these functions? First, it can be intake interview to collect needed information. So information oriented interview can be like intake of information. तो अगर आपको वो information पहले किसी और जरिए से नहीं मिली, you are seeing the client for the first time and you do not have any other information or file of the client, then usually first interview will be about getting information. आप कहाँ पैदा हुए, आप क्या करते हैं, आपकी एजुकेशन क्या है, आपके बहन भाई कितने हैं, आपके पेरेंट्स और मेडिकल हिस्ट्री एंड सो ऑन. सो दिस इज यूजुअली टू गेट इंफॉर्मेशन अबाउट द क्लाइंट और उसके बाद बाकी सेशंस उसके साथ चलते हैं. द सेकेंड थिंग इज इट कैन सिग्नल द बिगिनिंग ऑफ अ रिलेशनशिप. Sometime you have all that information on record and you start more comfortably and you want to build on a good relationship between the client and counselor. तो वो आप चाहते हैं कि relationship establish करें and your emphasis is on establishing rapport. The counselor will respond to the client predominantly through the use of probes, accents, closed questions and requests for clarification. तो usually जो है वो इस तरह से जो है वो कोशिश की जाती है कि जो काउंसलर है वो इज अटेंडिंग टू द क्लाइंट, इज लिसनिंग प्रॉपरली और लिसनिंग के दौरान जो है वो प्रोब्स देता है, फीडबैक प्रोवाइड करता है. क्लोज्ड एंडेड क्वेश्चंस जनरली हो सकता है कि इंफॉर्मेशन टेकिंग के दौरान ज़्यादा हों, बट ओपन एंडेड क्वेश्चंस विल आल्सो कंपनी. लेकिन आमतौर पे जब आप इंफॉर्मेशन फैक्चुअल लेते हैं तो क्लोज्ड एंडेड क्वेश्चंस जो है उनकी तादाद ज़्यादा हो जाती है. एंड सम टाइम यू आल्सो यूज प्रोब्स फर्दर, यू वांट टू नो और क्लैरिफिकेशन करना चाहते हैं कि अच्छा मुझे ये इस बात की ये समझ आई थी, तो आर यू सेइंग दिस, क्योंकि ये बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट है कि अर्ली स्टेज में अगर कोई एम्बिग्विटी है तो वो क्लियर हो जाए. व्हाट इज द फॉर्मेट ऑफ इनिशियल इंटरव्यू if it is information oriented? First you would have identifying data, client कौन है, कहाँ से आया है, उसके बारे में information होती है. Then presenting problems, both primary and secondary problems are considered here. What is the main problem? Although I said that it is not essential that you use that word problem if you haven't initiated that interview, but यहाँ पे इससे मुराद ये है कि इफ देयर इज अ प्रॉब्लम, कोई भी इशू क्या है, व्हाट इज द इशू, और मेन इशू क्या है और सेकेंडरी इश्यूज क्या हैं. इन फोकस एनालिसिस वी हैव डिस्कस्ड दैट सेवरल इश्यूज व्हिच आर बॉदरिंग अ क्लाइंट, बट यू कैन नॉट कंसंट्रेट ऑन ऑल ऑफ देम एट वंस. So it is important that you identify the important ones, the main problems, issues, and the secondary ones. And then you would also like to know client's current life setting. What are the activities of the client? क्या करता है, hobbies क्या हैं, vocational, educational, उसकी background क्या है, किस तरह से आजकल अपना daily life कैसे गुजारता है, and so on. Another element of information oriented first interview is family history. You want to know about family also, because no one functions in vacuum. क्लाइंट जो है उसकी ज़िंदगी पर बहुत ज़्यादा असर उसकी फैमिली का होता है. What is the type of interaction in the family? फैमिली किस तरह की है, फैमिली में से मुराद क्या है, सिंगल पेरेंट फैमिली, पेरेंट्स क्या करते हैं, और उसके अलावा जो है वो बच्चे उनके कितने हैं, आपके सिबलिंग्स कितने हैं क्लाइंट के, क्या वो फैमिली के साथ रहता है, अलग रहता है, उसका बर्थ ऑर्डर क्या है, क्या क्या तरतीब है, एजुकेशन सबकी क्या है, एंड सो ऑन. देन पर्सनल हिस्ट्री. यू वुड आल्सो लाइक टू नो अबाउट द कॉन्टेक्स्ट, बैकग्राउंड ऑफ द क्लाइंट. डेवलपमेंटल स्टेजेस से वो सक्सेसफुली उसने अचीव की, एजुकेशन कहाँ कहाँ से हासिल की, if there is any employment history, you would like to know about that, and all other things which could be related with the client. Any medical illness, any previous mental health problem, issues, had he seen a counselor or a clinician before, and so on. Then you would like to know about what is your perception of the client during the interview. How the client is talking, उसकी speech जो है वो accelerated है, slow है, and then how he is behaving during the interview, how is his get-up, the way he is dressed, the way he responds to the counselor. Smile देता है, depressive लगता है, behavioral आपकी जो observation है, that is very important here. उसकी perceptions में आपको कोई distortions नजर आती है, whatever could be observed during the interview, whenever you are getting data at that time, it is not essential कि इसके लिए कोई अलग से time आपने रखना है observation के लिए. While you are getting other information during that time, how do you perceive your client? And then summary and recommendations is the last step. That information oriented interview में it is important कि जब वो एक प्रोफाइल बनती है पूरे इंटरव्यू की, तो उसके आखिर में जो है वो सारी इंफॉर्मेशन को काउंसलर रिलेट करे. The counselor shall be able to relate each and every section, that how medical history is related with current behavior, how family interaction is related with the current issues of the client, and so on. The next type of initial interview is relationship-oriented first interview. Here focus is more on the client's attitudes and emotions. We discussed in one of the previous lectures that the focus shall not be the problem. Mainly the focus of the counseling session is first on the person. So what are the feelings and motives and attitude of the client? क्योंकि हो सकता है कि if you are targeting first the problem or theme of the problem, तो फिर आप उसकी feelings को ignore कर दें, and later you may not be able to concentrate on that fully. So it is important that you concentrate on client's feelings, especially if it is a relationship oriented interview, और आपका purpose जो है वो ये नहीं है कि सिर्फ कुछ इन्फॉर्मेशन हासिल करने के बाद उसको वोकेशनल गाइडेंस प्रोवाइड कर दें या फिर आप सब्जेक्ट की सिलेक्शन में मदद दे दें, बल्कि उसकी बजाय जो है देयर इज़ सम इमोशनल प्रॉब्लम और यू वांट टू क्रिएट एन गुड रिलेशनशिप और उसकी बेस पे आप आगे चलना चाहते हैं. द रिक्वायर्ड स्किल्स दैट आर यूज्ड ड्यूरिंग दिस इंटरव्यू आर द स्किल्स दैट वी हैव डिस्कस्ड बिफोर, लाइक पैराफ्रेजिंग स्किल, रीस्टेटमेंट स्किल, reflection skill, summarizing skill, and then acknowledgement of non-verbal behavior. The counselor shall be able to accumulate all the information that he or she is obtaining from the client, and at the same time use his or her counseling skills also. और counseling skills कौन सी हैं ये तो हमने बहुत डिटेल में पढ़ लिया हुआ है, and this is the time that you remember all of them कि कौन कौन सी थी. When we are talking about essentials of some interviews, चाहे वो initial है, middle phase है या कोई आखिरी interviews हैं, at the same time it's important that we shall recognize the non-helpful behaviors during the counseling. कोई ऐसी चीज़ें भी हैं जो hindrance create करती हैं, so let's discuss those particular issues. It is generally agreed by the counselors, and through research it has also been shown that it is not effective if the counselor starts advice giving. वो कोई नसीहत करना शुरू कर देता है कि आपको ऐसा करना चाहिए और आपको इस तरह नहीं करना चाहिए. The reason is that you are not focusing then on the internal viewpoint of the client, and we have studied that you must tune into the client's internal viewpoint rather than concentrating on external viewpoint, because if we are concentrating on external viewpoint, then you want to see the client on that place. आप चाहते हैं कि वो आपकी जगह होकर सोचे, वो इस तरह क्यों नहीं सोचता? And we are talking from our reference, so it's not an empathic attitude. So it is not appropriate to give advice to the client. You just help in self-growth and self-awareness of the client. Ultimate responsibility is of the client. वो खुद डिसाइड करे कि उसकी ज़िंदगी में उसके करंट सर्कमस्टांसिस में उसके लिए क्या अप्रोप्रिएट है. द सेकेंड थिंग इज लेक्चरिंग. समटाइम लेक्चरिंग इज डन इन अ डिस्गाइज्ड वे. आप डायरेक्टली नहीं कोई लेक्चर देते, लेकिन यू हैव पर्टिकुलर वैल्यूज ऑफ योर्स और आप उन वैल्यूज की वजह से एक लेक्चर सा स्टार्ट कर देते हैं. लेक्चरिंग जब होती है तो एक्चुअली दैट स्टार्ट्स अ स्ट्रगल ऑफ पावर या बैटल ऑफ पावर बिटवीन क्लाइंट एंड काउंसलर एंड नीदर ऑफ देम विंस दिस बैटल। क्योंकि आप लेक्चर देते हैं अपनी वैल्यूज के मुताबिक, द क्लाइंट स्टार्ट्स डिफेंडिंग दैट लेक्चरिंग क्योंकि द क्लाइंट हैज हिज ओन वैल्यूज, सो इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट दैट लेक्चरिंग डजंट स्टार्ट इन द काउंसलिंग। द थर्ड thing is that excessive questioning is not helpful. Especially client-centered counseling believes that we should concentrate on the expression and stories of the client rather than asking excessive questions. Although it is important that open-ended questions and sometimes closed-ended questions are asked, and if there is a good mixture of open-ended and closed questions, so it is better to get a lot of information. But at the same time, it is also possible that if you are bombarding with too many questions, then the client may be feeling that he is perhaps investigated या उसकी interrogation हो रही है, so that could create problem in self-disclosure. The last point is storytelling. It is not appropriate to describe different stories during counseling sessions. It has been seen that sometimes storytelling could be helpful क्योंकि sometimes it provides a direction to the client. There is a very famous legendary family counselor, Milton Erickson. So he had that habit of stories which were very metaphorically arranged. तो उनसे कई दफ़ा काउंसलर जब वो डिस्क्राइब करता था तो क्लाइंट को बहुत हेल्प हो जाती थी टू रिलेट हिमसेल्फ टू दैट सिचुएशन, और फिर उसके मुताबिक जो था ही वुड बी एबल टू डिसाइड कि उसकी सिचुएशन में ये स्टोरी उसको कैसे हेल्प कर सकती है. बट जनरली काउंसलर्स एग्री दैट इट इज़ नॉट इफेक्टिव इफ काउंसलर स्टार्ट स्टोरी टेलिंग, और उनकी रोशनी में अगर वो चाहे कि क्लाइंट जो है वो सोचे तो इट इज़ नॉट वेरी अप्रोप्रिएट. आपको स्लाइड में एडवाइस गिविंग पर कोई थोड़ी सी चीज़ें हैं जो लिखी हुई हैं. I would like to talk about that also. Knowles found in 1979 that 70 to 90% of all responses on a crisis line were related with advice giving. Although counselors agree that it is not very useful to give advices to the client क्योंकि आप उनकी जगह पे होके फैसले ना करें तो बेहतर है, लेकिन क्राइसिस हॉटलाइन जब होती हैं तो आमतौर पर कई दफ़ा शायद काउंसलर्स ये फील करते हैं कि इस वक्त क्योंकि क्राइसिस की सिचुएशन है, मे बी इट विल बी हेल्पफुल इफ वी प्रोवाइड एडवाइस, डायरेक्ट एडवाइस टू द क्लाइंट. बट सैक हैड पॉइंटेड आउट इन 1985 that it is not essential that advice giving is always destructive. So sometimes advice is really required, especially when there is a crisis situation and when you think that the client is not able to decide for himself in the current circumstances. So maybe आप थोड़ी सी advice दे दें और फिर उसको empower करें कि later he will be able to decide for himself. The next thing is that what is the importance of goal settings in counseling interviews? Once the counselor is able to establish a rapport, a relationship between the client and counselor, then he or she asks client to describe about himself, his stories or whatever, and then he is trying to focus on the elements of those stories by providing good attending and listening skills. And finally, through all that and providing structure and listening, the client is able to focus on the goals. जो भी उसकी particular goals हैं, अब उस पर उसकी concentration हो जाती है after establishing relationship, after having a good structure of the counseling session, then the ultimate focus is on the goals. So goals within counseling help to set the tone and direction one travels with their clients. As I have mentioned before, that without establishing goals, a counseling session wanders aimlessly because you do not know कि आपका टारगेट क्या है, आपने टारगेट के मुताबिक अपने बिहेवियर को कैसे चेंज करना है या सेट करना है. It has been pointed out by a rule in 1982 that goals are the energizing fabric of daily living but are often elusive. So this is a matter of great concern that although goals are very important, but sometimes goals are elusive. हमारी गोल्स इस तरह की हम रख लेते हैं जो अचीवेबल ही नहीं होती और उसमें कोई और प्रॉब्लम होती है। तो ये कौन कौन सी गोल्स हो सकती हैं विच कुड बी अनऑब्टेनेबल, विच आर इल्यूसिव, विच आर अनरियलिस्टिक? फॉर एग्जाम्पल, दीज गोल्स कुड बी अनफोकस्ड. वी आर नॉट स्पेसिफिक अबाउट गोल्स. आपके पास एक जनरल सा आइडिया है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, द क्लाइंट सेज दैट आई वॉन्ट excellence in education. So what is excellence? Does this mean that you will be on the top और सारे लोग आपसे पीछे हों क्लास में? या does this mean कि आपका A grade आ जाए या among first 5 and so on? So it is important that you focus on your goal कि वो क्या है, particularly एक goal आप उसको identify कर लें. That could be measurable. जैसे कि मैं ये कहूँ कि मेरी गोल ये है कि अब मैं फर्स्ट 10 स्टूडेंट्स में थी एज फार एज मार्क्स आर कंसर्न, बट आई वांट टू बी अमंग द 5 फर्स्ट स्टूडेंट्स. तो ये एक स्पेसिफिक गोल हो जाती है. देन द गोल्स कुड बी अनरियलिस्टिक. समटाइम्स द क्लाइंट्स वुड हैव अनरियलिस्टिक गोल्स. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, अनरियलिस्टिक गोल्स कौन सी हो सकती हैं? दैट आई वॉन्ट टू have self-actualization. I want to be happy. और इसी तरीके की I want to be perfect. These are unrealistic. अब happiness की बात लें. Although all of these goals have high merit, it is very important that a person shall be feeling well, shall be happy. लेकिन the problem with this kind of goal is that I have a particular problem at the moment, and when that problem is solved, I may become happy, but then I would have another problem. So this is a goal which is really difficult to maintain, although this is having a real and high merit. It is important to stay happy, but it is rather difficult to obtain. Ultimate happiness is difficult to obtain. So if you focus on the problem, एक ये issue है जिसको solve करना है, तो this is more realistic. The next one is uncoordinated goals. Uncoordinated वो होती हैं जिनमें inconsistency होती है. अब incompatible goals जो हैं वो इसमें आएंगी. एक चीज़ आप कुछ चाह रहे हैं, दूसरी कोई और डायमेंशन में है. दोनों की डायरेक्शंस ही डिफरेंट हैं. आप एक हासिल करते हैं तो दूसरी आपके हाथ से निकल जाती है. और यू आर बिहेविंग इन एन इनकंसिस्टेंट वे. अनकोऑर्डिनेटेड गोल्स दो तरह की हो सकती हैं. वन इज रियली अनकोऑर्डिनेटेड, the other is seemingly uncoordinated. Really uncoordinated वो होती है when the person is entering into counseling relationship but doesn't want to work on the change dimension, doesn't want to change himself and herself. So this is really uncoordinated. कि कैसे ये हो सकता है कि आप कह रहे हैं कि मैं अपनी ज़ात में improvement भी चाह रहा हूँ और साथ कोई डायरेक्शन में काम भी नहीं करना. Always you are saying yes but. तो ऐसे कैसे होगा? So this is incompatible. Then the next one is seemingly uncoordinated. तो seemingly uncoordinated इस तरह से होते हैं कि जैसे they think that they are having uncoordinated goals, but they are not really goals. उनकी असल में कोई proper goals ही नहीं होती, and they are not motivated to move in that direction. तो वो motivation नहीं है, but they have joined, और लेकिन they do not want to work in that particular direction. तो वो seemingly uncoordinated होते हैं. I would like to talk now about some guidelines as far as goals are concerned. These guidelines have been provided by Dyer and Rind in 1977. कि goals किस तरह की होनी चाहिए? जब हम ये कहते हैं कि goals unrealistic ना हो, unfocused ना हो, incompatible ना हो, तो goals किस तरह की होनी चाहिए? First thing is goals are mutually agreed on by the client and counselor. ऐसा ना हो कि client कुछ और सोच रहा है और counselor किसी और direction में सोच रहा है. Client कहता है कि मुझे जो है वो happiness चाहिए. The counselor thinks कि no, it is not possible, तो मैं किसी और direction में काम करता हूँ. It is appropriate that they both discuss that first कि what is the goal और किसको हम हासिल करना चाहते हैं, इसी के मुताबिक हमारा करंट बिहेवियर डिटरमिन होगा. द नेक्स्ट गोल इज दैट गोल्स आर स्पेसिफिक. As I have discussed before, if they are specific, then it is more easy to work in the direction of that particular goal. And then when you achieve that, you will also know this. Yes, I have achieved this particular goal because that was very specific. It is not abstract like happiness. How can you say a person is 100% happy, 90% happy and 50% happy? So it is attainable, measurable, and this is also mentioned in the next steps. The next one is goals are relevant to changing self-defeating behavior. All of the goals, in fact, shall be related with the change of self-defeating behavior, that behavior which is not helping the client, which is in fact creating a barrier and hindrance to the therapeutic process. So all of the goals shall be compatible with that. The next one is that goals are achievement and success oriented. They should be clearly useful, beneficial for the client. They should provide a payoff for the client. Intrinsic or extrinsic uske benefits nazar aane chahiye. Another thing is that goals are quantifiable and observable. If there is any change, you are able to know that. You could be able to see that the client looks more adjusted. And if you are using some measure, तो आप quantitatively भी इसको describe कर सके. If you are using some psychological test, तो उस पर उसका स्कोर जो है वो ये ना हो कि बज़ाहिर आपको लग रहा है क्लाइंट इज इम्प्रूविंग, लेकिन स्कोर ये बता रहे कि क्लाइंट इज एक्चुअली डिटीरियोरेटिंग. सो इट शुड बी क्वांटिफाइबल, measurable and observable. The next thing regarding goals is that goals are understandable and can be restated clearly. They are specific, that is why they can be restated clearly, and they are understood, understandable. क्लाइंट को भी समझ आनी चाहिए, काउंसलर को भी, और अगर उनको दोबारा आपको डिस्क्राइब करना चाहें तो दे शुड नॉट बी सो एम्बिगुअस कि आप उसको रीस्टेट ना कर सकें. So this was all about initial session and then working on different goals. Then I am moving to the middle phase, or you could say working in a counseling relationship. The first stage is when you create and establish rapport. आप relationship की तरफ ध्यान देते हैं, और after exploration and introductions, information seeking, the next stage is understanding and action phase, where the counselor has to decide about what is going to happen in the middle phase. कौन कौन सी strategies use करनी चाहिए, क्या techniques होनी चाहिए, काउंसलिंग में कोई और प्रॉब्लम्स जो नज़र आते हैं उनको दूर करना चाहिए. वी विल बी टॉकिंग दैट पर्टिकुलर इशू इन दिस सेगमेंट ऑफ द लेक्चर. आई शो यू अ स्लाइड. इस स्लाइड पे आपको यू कैन सी 2 tables and you can see also number of captions that some areas of the client are known to self and not known to self, and similarly there are some areas of the self which are known to others but the person doesn't know about that. So known to others but the person is not aware, and then there are areas when the person is also aware, other people are also aware of that. अब आपको ये एक लेफ्ट साइड पे टेबल नजर आ रही है. इनिशियली द क्लाइंट एंटर्स इन द काउंसलिंग रिलेशनशिप विद अ लॉट ऑफ सप्रेशंस एंड रिप्रेशंस. बहुत सारे एरियाज होते हैं जो उनके बारे में अवेयरनेस ही नहीं होती हमें, एंड देयर आर मैनी एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ आवर सेल्फ विच आर समटाइम डिस्गाइज्ड. वी डू नॉट नो अबाउट दैट एंड अदर पीपल आल्सो डू नॉट नो अबाउट दैट. तो समटाइम दे आर a process of repression and sometime forcefully हमने उनको suppress कर दिया होता है due to our circumstances. So the goal of the counseling is in fact that area of free activity is expanded. आप दोबारा ये slide देखिए, आपको right side पे जो table नजर आ रही है, this is after counseling. The area of free activity which is known to self and known to others is expanded, while shrinking the other blind areas. Which areas? Which are not known to self, not known to others, or which are other way around, that they are known to self lekin they are not known to other people. So the goal of a therapy or counseling session is that you expand that area of free activity. So in other words, you create more self-awareness in the person, and those areas are finally reduced जो कि आपकी नज़र से ओझल हैं. सो दैट इज़ द पर्पस ऑफ द थेरेपी कि आपको अपनी अवेयरनेस हो जाए और वो एरियाज कम रह जाएं जो कि हिडन हैं. तो अब ये सारी जो काउंसलिंग है वो उसके मुताबिक ही चलती है. So, what are the skills that are used in understanding and action phase? कौन कौन सी skills हैं जो यूज की जाती हैं action और understanding phase में? We have discussed in detail about all of these skills. इसलिए जो skills की पहले बात हो चुकी है उनको मैं तफसील से यहाँ बयान नहीं करूँगी. I will just mention them. While if there are skills जिनके बारे में पहले बात नहीं हुई, I will expand on them. So let's see what are these skills. Changing perceptions. We have talked about that sometimes people's perceptions are distorted. They are not perceiving things realistically, and the counselor works in that direction that these distortions are eliminated या at least reduce करने की कोशिश की जाती है. Second thing is that you providing a kind of atmosphere in the counseling interviews, sessions which are leading the client toward more self-disclosure. और ये leading कैसे possible होती है? By having appropriate silence. You are not interrupting the client when it is not appropriate. You try to give a proper space to your client, so it is not prematurely interrupted. Then you ask appropriate questions, you accept the client, you are non-judgmental, and you have a positive regard for the client as a person. You may not like one particular behavior, but you acknowledge the respect for the client as a different and unique human being. And obviously then you use paraphrasing, reassurance and interpretation as different counseling skills. Then a multi-focused responding is required. When I say multi-focused, it means it is affective, cognitive and behavioral focus. किस तरह से? You are concentrating on the behavior of the client. जो भी चीज़ें आपको नज़र आती हैं, non-verbal हैं. They could be cognitive. You are giving due importance to the thinking and thought pattern of your client. And affective, what are the emotional aspect of your client's statements? आप उनकी feelings पे भी concentrate करते हैं. The next is accurate empathy. We have talked in detail about empathy, so I don't need, I think, to elaborate on this issue here. The next point is self-disclosure. We have talked about self-disclosure before, but I would like to add just one point here, that the advantage of self-disclosure from the counselor could be more than one. Egan, for example, has pointed out that if a counselor is self-disclosing, तो उसके दो benefit हो सकते हैं. One thing is that the counselor will provide as a model. So client will also follow that self-disclosure, and he will also be able to disclose himself or herself. Second thing, the client will be able to have a new perspective on the situation or the issues. So self-disclosure could have a number of advantages. एक advantage हमने पहले भी इसके अलावा discuss किया हुआ है. याद है वो क्या था? वो ये था कि when a counselor is self-disclosing, then the client thinks that he is a normal human being like me and having similar problems. So that helps in creating a good relationship between both. Then the next point is immediacy. What is immediacy? Immediacy का मतलब है you are in the immediate situation. Immediacy could be related with two things. One is relationship immediacy, that what is going on between client and counselor that is working perfectly, what is happening now, उसके मुताबिक जो है वो उनकी communication जारी है. And then now and here is another immediacy dimension. That means that you are currently with the client regarding any event that could be discussed or happened during the counseling session. The next point is humor. That is a good counseling skill, and we did not discuss that in micro skills क्योंकि वहाँ पर हम ज़्यादा important skills जो थे उनकी जिक्र कर रहे थे. So the advantage of humor is that sometime it will reduce tension in the counseling session. या फिर थोड़ा सा एक टेंशन जो क्लाइंट के जहन पर सवार होती है उसको भी रिड्यूस कर देता है ह्यूमर. बट इट डज नॉट मीन दैट द काउंसलर कंसंट्रेट्स ऑन टेलिंग डिफरेंट जोक्स. वो जोक्स सुनाने का एक ज़रिया नहीं होना चाहिए और गपशप का ज़रिया नहीं होना चाहिए काउंसलिंग को, लेकिन to some extent it's appropriate to have a sense of good sense of humor. The next point is confrontation, and we have discussed while we were talking about confrontation skills that the purpose of confrontation is not to challenge in a negative way or to humiliate the client. The purpose is to just remind and to shed some light on the inconsistencies between the client's non-verbal and verbal communications, या past और जो current behavior है उसके दरमियान कोई inconsistency है, तो you just pinpoint that. So that is the purpose of the confrontation, and it shall be used very skillfully and appropriately. So this was all about today's lecture. Let's now discuss what we have studied today. Today we talked about 5 stages of a counseling interview, और हमने एक ये वाइडर लेवल पे बात की थी कि जो पूरी काउंसलिंग है उसमें कौन कौन सी स्टेजेस होती हैं. एंड वी टॉक्ड अबाउट डिफरेंट स्टेजेस, जिसका स्टार्ट रेपो एस्टैब्लिशिंग से होता है, रिलेशनशिप बिल्डिंग से होता है, एंड देन यू गैदर इंफॉर्मेशन अबाउट द क्लाइंट एंड देन यू असेस व्हाट आर द स्ट्रेंथ्स ऑफ द क्लाइंट, क्योंकि उन्हीं स्ट्रेंथ्स को आपने साथ लेकर चलना होता है फॉर हैविंग अ ग्रेटर चेंज इन द क्लाइंट. एंड देन वी आल्सो टॉक्ड अबाउट different aspects and different stages of interview. For example, you get a lot of information about the client, जो चीज़ें required होती हैं वो आप हासिल करते हैं, and then you think about other alternatives that could be possible and what are the goals of the client. और ये important है कि client और counselor जो हैं दोनों agree करें कि कौन सी goals जो हैं shall be achieved during the counseling sessions. And finally, that learning that happens during the counseling sessions should be generalized toward the daily life of the client. After discussing 5 stages of counseling, we talked about our first interview. And we also discussed different types of initial interview. For example, the initial interview can be asked for by the counselor, और ये भी हो सकता है कि client उसकी request करे कि he wants to meet the counselor for some particular issue. And then we also discussed 2 other types of interview. One is information oriented and the other is relationship oriented. और ये दोनों इंटरव्यू जो है उनके मुताबिक जो है वो काउंसलिंग उसी तरह से चलती है जो कि उस पर्टिकुलर इंटरव्यू की डिमांड होती है. Then we also talked about goals, कि goals कैसी होनी चाहिए. Goals के बारे में बड़ी क्लैरिटी होनी चाहिए. क्लाइंट और काउंसलर जो हैं दोनों they both should agree कि what are the ultimate targets they want to achieve through this counseling. And we also discussed that the goals shall be realistic, focused, specific, measurable, observable. और अगर इस तरीके से टारगेट आप रखेंगे तो it is easy to achieve those particular goals. Then we also talked about working in the relationship. That could be generally referred to as the middle phase of the interview, when the counselor is concentrating on understanding and action skills. और ये वो पीरियड होता है जिसमें बहुत सारे एलिमेंट्स काउंसलिंग के देखे जाते हैं कि विच आर अनहेल्पफुल, किनको अवॉइड करना है, कौन सी चीज़ें क्लाइंट में ऐसी हैं जिनको इम्प्रूव करने की ज़रूरत है. वी आल्सो टॉक्ड अबाउट सम नॉन हेल्पफुल एटीट्यूड्स आर things that could create hindrance in the counseling. For example, excessive questioning, storytelling, advice giving, and so on. And then we discussed that usually the client enters in the therapy, in the counseling session with a lot of repression and suppressions. And the primary purpose of the counseling is that those aspects of the person are expanded toward which he has clarity, या उसकी सेल्फ अवेयरनेस को बढ़ा दिया जाए और वो एरियाज जो उसकी पहुंच से बाहर हैं या जिनके बारे में वो नहीं जानता और बाकी लोग भी नहीं जानते, they shall be shrinking at the same time. So this was all about what we have discussed today. अगले लेक्चर में फिर मुलाकात होगी and we will be talking again about counseling process. अगले लेक्चर तक के लिए अल्लाह हाफिज.